There was no sheriff, no mayor, no courthouse, and no deed to the land anyone stood on. The gold was there. The whiskey was there. And 25,000 people had decided that was enough. This is the town they built in a stolen valley. And the summer the most famous card player in the West sat down at the wrong table. In June of 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. Officially, the purpose was to scout the area. The government had been looking for a route for a new fort. His expedition found gold. The Black Hills were Lakota Treaty land. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had guaranteed them to the Lakota people for as long as the rivers shall run and the grass shall grow. The treaty was explicit and unambiguous. The government found gold. The treaty became inconvenient. By 1875, prospectors were slipping into the Black Hills illegally, ignoring Army patrols sent to remove them. By the spring of 1876, the Army had effectively given up trying to enforce the treaty, and men poured in by the thousands. In one of those gulches, a narrow valley in the northern Black Hills, a rough camp arose that would become the most famous town in the American West. Deadwood. The gulch had good color. Gold visible in the creek sediment that ran down from the hills above. Word spread fast. By the summer of 1876. 25,000 people had crammed into a canyon that was barely wide enough to swing a pick. There was no official government. The land belonged, by treaty, to the Lakota, which meant the men settling it had no legal right to be there and therefore no legal framework to operate under. Miners' courts handled disputes with the blunt pragmatism of men who had no other option. A jury of miners decided who owned a claim. And that was that. What grew up in Deadwood was a city built entirely on the logic of the gold rush. Money moved fastest. Law moved slowest. And whoever was standing on the dirt when it came time to count was the one who owned it. The saloons came first. Then the general stores. Then the brothels. Then the banks. Then an opera house. Then a newspaper. The Deadwood Pioneer started publishing in 1876. Which meant the town had a press before it had a street address. Into this town, in the summer of 1876, rode James Butler Hickok. He was 38 years old. He was called Wild Bill, a name he had earned through a series of violent confrontations over the preceding decade that had left him with a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. He was also, by 1876, not the man the reputation described. His eyesight was deteriorating. He may have had a venereal disease that would have eventually blinded him. He drank more than was good for him and gambled more than he could afford. He had married a circus owner named Agnes Lake earlier that year, written her a series of tender letters, and then ridden west toward Deadwood, which was the place a man with his particular skills and his particular reputation could still make a living. He played poker. He was not having a good summer. August 2, 1876. Wild Bill Hickok sat down at a poker table in Nuttall and Mann's saloon on Main Street. He took the only open seat, with his back to the room. Throughout his career, Hickok had been careful about positioning himself near walls with a clear view of the door. He had survived long enough to develop specific habits around survival. On this afternoon, he asked another player to trade seats with him. The man refused. Hickok stayed. A man named Jack McCall entered the saloon. McCall was a drifter with a history in the camps. A man Hickok had beaten at cards the previous day and reportedly offered money to for a meal afterward. An act of condescension, whether meant or not, that McCall had apparently not forgotten. McCall walked up behind Hickok and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok fell face forward onto the table. The cards in his hand scattered. 2 black aces. 2 black eights. and one unknown fifth card. The hand that would be called the dead man's hand ever after. He died immediately. McCall was tried in a minor's court that same day and acquitted. He was later tried again. Double jeopardy did not apply, since the first trial had been an extra-legal proceeding. Convicted and hanged. Wild Bill Hickok was buried on the hill above Deadwood. The town kept going. Deadwood survived the gold running out, and the fire of 1879 that burned most of it down, and the transition from territory to state, and the arrival of law in the form of sheriffs and courts and eventually a county commission. It survived because the men and women who built it in the Gulch decided they were going to keep building. Gold or no gold, law or no law. Calamity Jane, Martha Jane Canary, arrived in 1876 and never entirely left. She nursed the sick during a smallpox epidemic with a matter-of-fact courage that most official accounts of Deadwood neglect to mention. Seth Bullock became the town's first sheriff in 1877 and spent the next decades turning a mining camp into a real town with building codes and civil order and all the other apparatus of civilization that 25,000 people in a narrow gulch eventually required. Wyatt Earp passed through. Lame Johnny, a local outlaw, was lynched on the road out of town. The Chinese workers who had helped build the infrastructure of the territory were taxed and restricted and eventually driven out entirely. The town was no different than any other in that, eventually, tourists came. They came because the name meant something. Because the story had gotten out. The gold, the gamblers, the famous dead. Because a man named Adams brought his vacation money and stood on the wooden sidewalks of Main Street and felt the weight of something that had actually happened there. The town named itself after the dead trees on its hillsides. The dead trees were cleared. The gold ran out, but the name stayed, and what it attached to kept growing. Deadwood is still there. The hills are still there. Still green in summer. Still gold in the particular light of late September. The creek still runs in the bottom of the gulch. Wild Bill Hickok's grave is on the hill, where it has always been. They buried Calamity Jane next to him. 30 years later. Because she asked them to. The cards are gone. The table is long since burned or rotted or carried away in someone's pocket as a souvenir. But the hand. 2 black aces. 2 black eights. That card combination has been called the dead man's hand in every poker game played in the American West since August 2, 1876. If this story got to you the way it gets to me, hit the like button. Share it with someone who loves the West. Subscribe if you haven't. 60 of these are coming. One story at a time. And this one is just the beginning. Subscribe, like, share. I'll see you in the next one.